My name is Claire Bennett, and for 11 years I believed that patience was a virtue that would eventually be rewarded. I believed that if I kept my head down, kept smiling, kept absorbing the small cruelties of my husband's family, something would shift. Someone would notice. Someone would say, "Enough." I was wrong. Nobody was going to say it for me. I had to say it myself. And I had to say it with my hand against my sister-in-law's face at my own anniversary dinner, in front of 40 guests, 3 tiers of candlelight, and my 2 children. This is that story. The dinner was supposed to be simple. 11 years married to Daniel Whitfield, and for the first time, his mother, Eleanor, had insisted on hosting our anniversary at the family estate, instead of letting us plan our own quiet evening. "It's a milestone, Claire," she'd said over the phone, her voice honey-smooth the way it always was right before she took something from me. 11 years is nothing to dismiss. Let the family celebrate you both properly. I should have heard the warning bell in that sentence. Let the family celebrate you. As if celebration was something granted, not something I already deserved. I said yes anyway, because I always said yes. Because Daniel's face lit up at the idea of his mother making an effort, and because some small, stubborn part of me still hoped that after 11 years, after 2 children, after everything I had given to this family, I might finally be let all the way in. The Whitfields were old money, the kind of old money that never says the word money out loud, that talks instead about legacy and standards and how things are done. Eleanor ran the family like a company, with a board she never officially appointed, but that everyone deferred to anyway. Daniel's father had passed 6 years earlier, and since then Eleanor's word had become law, softened only by the appearance of warmth. And then there was Vanessa. Vanessa Whitfield Cole was Daniel's younger sister, 34 to his 38, married into more money than she was born into, and possessed of the particular confidence that comes from never once in her life being told no. She was beautiful in the sharp, symmetrical way of someone who had spent a fortune making sure of it, and she had disliked me from the moment Daniel brought me home. "She's very practical," Vanessa had said at our engagement dinner 9 years ago, holding a glass of champagne like a prop. "I mean that as a compliment," she'd added, in the tone people use when they very much do not mean something as a compliment. I came from a family of school teachers in Ohio. My mother taught 3rd grade for 31 years. My father drove a delivery route. I had worked 2 jobs through college and graduated with honors and no debt, which I was proud of, until I learned that in Vanessa's world, working hard for something was itself a kind of embarrassment proof that you hadn't been given enough. For 11 years, I absorbed it. The comments about my department store dress at Thanksgiving, the way Eleanor introduced me to guests as Daniel's wife rather than by my name, the seating charts that always, somehow, put me at the far end of the table, near the kitchen door, where I could be useful if something needed refilling. I remember our wedding, 6 months after that garden proposal, and how Eleanor had quietly suggested, 3 separate times, that perhaps a smaller guest list, on your side, would help balance the numbers more elegantly, since the Whitfields had, in her words, rather a lot of important relationships to maintain. I remember agreeing to cut my college roommate and 2 cousins from the list because I didn't want to start my marriage by making waves, and I remember crying about it alone in a dressing room 3 days before the wedding, and telling no one because who was there to tell? Daniel was busy. My mother would have worried. So I folded the hurt up small and put it away, the way I would learn to do, again and again, for the next 11 years. I remember Miles's christening, when Eleanor hired a photographer who took over 400 photos that day, and somehow, in the entire batch, captured exactly 6 of me, all of them from the side, mid-motion, as if I were incidental scenery rather than his mother. I remember Sophie's 5th birthday party, hosted at the estate because Eleanor insisted her granddaughter deserved a real party, dear, not just balloons in your little backyard, and how she'd taken over the guest list, the theme, the cake, until my daughter's own birthday felt like an event I'd been invited to attend rather than one I had planned. None of these things, on their own, seemed worth a fight. That was the design of it. I understand now cruelty small enough, each individual time, that objecting would make me look unreasonable, oversensitive, ungrateful for the generosity being shown to me. It is a particular kind of trap, and it took me 11 years and 1 slap to finally see the shape of the cage I'd been living in. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself that Daniel loved me, that our children Sophie, 9, and Miles, 6, were happy and healthy, and didn't seem to notice the undercurrents the way I did. I told myself that dignity meant not reacting, that the high road was always the right road, and that eventually my calm would outlast their cruelty. I was very good at telling myself things that weren't true. I should back up, because I don't think this story makes sense without understanding how I ended up at that table in the first place, how a schoolteacher's daughter from Ohio ended up married into a family like the Whitfields at all. I met Daniel at a fundraiser, of all places, one I hadn't even wanted to attend. I was 26, working as a project coordinator for a nonprofit that built after-school literacy programs in underfunded districts, and my boss had asked me to represent our organization at a gala thrown by a foundation the Whitfields company sponsored. I owned exactly one dress nice enough for the occasion, a navy sheath I'd bought on clearance 3 years earlier for a cousin's wedding, and I remember standing near the edge of the ballroom, holding a glass of wine I couldn't really afford to enjoy because I was doing math about the Uber home in my head, feeling entirely out of place among women wearing what I now know were originals rather than department store approximations. Daniel found me there, not because I was the most glamorous woman in the room, I very much was not, but because, as he told me later, I was the only person at that entire gala who seemed to actually want to talk about the literacy program instead of talking about who else was in the room. We talked for 2 hours. He missed his own family's photo call because of it, something Eleanor never quite let either of us forget. He was easy to love, genuinely warm, unpretentious in a way that seemed almost accidental given how he'd been raised, quick to laugh, quicker to listen. When he proposed, 18 months later, in the same nonprofit's community garden, because I'd told him once, in passing, how much that garden meant to me, I said yes without a single hesitation. What I did not fully understand yet, standing in that garden with a ring on my finger, was that I wasn't just marrying Daniel. I was marrying an entire ecosystem, a family with its own laws, its own hierarchy, its own carefully maintained sense of who belonged and who was merely tolerated. Daniel didn't fully understand it either, or if he did, he'd spent so long inside it that he could no longer see its walls the way an outsider could. That blindness, more than any single cruelty from Eleanor or Vanessa, was the thing that nearly cost us our marriage. 11 years later, in a garden strung with lights instead of one growing vegetables. The estate was lit like something out of a film when we arrived, string lights threaded through the old oak trees in the back garden, 3 long tables set with white linen and gold-rimmed china that had been in the family for 4 generations. Eleanor had truly outdone herself, and for a moment, walking in with Daniel's hand at my back, and my children skipping ahead of us in their good clothes, I let myself believe this really was for me. Sophie wore a pale yellow dress I'd sewn buttons onto myself after she outgrew the last one. Miles had insisted on wearing his favorite dinosaur bow tie, which clashed magnificently with everything else at the party, and which I had let him wear anyway, because some battles aren't worth fighting, and because I loved that he didn't yet understand that anyone might judge him for it. 40 guests. Family friends, business associates of Eleanor's late husband, a scattering of cousins I saw maybe twice a year. Daniel worked the room the way he always did, warm, easy, well-liked, oblivious in the specific way that people who have never had to fight for their place in a room tend to be oblivious. I don't say that bitterly. I loved him. I still do, in the complicated way you love someone who failed to see you even while standing right beside you. Dinner was served at 8. Eleanor had arranged, as she always did, an elaborate multi-course affair with staff circulating with trays, but the first course, a delicate seared scallop dish, was set up buffet-style at the head table. Guests invited to serve themselves before taking their seats. Family style, the way we used to do it when the children were small, Eleanor had announced with a practiced little laugh. I was hungry. I had spent the entire afternoon helping coordinate the arrival of the flowers, wrangling Miles out of the koi pond twice, and hadn't eaten since a granola bar at 11 that morning. When the buffet line opened, I stepped forward with my plate, along with a handful of other guests, and began to serve myself a scallop and a small spoonful of the citrus reduction beside it. That was when Vanessa's hand closed around my wrist, hard enough that I gasped and nearly dropped the serving spoon. "Excuse me," she said, her voice pitched to Carrie, sweet and venomous in the way only she could manage. But in this family, Guests of honor let the actual family serve themselves first. Have you forgotten your place, Claire? I froze. The room, or at least the 20 or so guests near enough to hear, had gone quiet in that specific way a room goes quiet when it senses a scene is about to happen and doesn't quite know whether to look away or lean in. Vanessa, I said carefully, it's a buffet. I know what a buffet is, she snapped. And then, unbelievably, in front of my children, in front of Daniel's stunned face, in front of 40 guests at my own anniversary dinner, she slapped me. The sound cracked across the garden like a dropped plate. My cheek burned instantly, a sharp white heat that bloomed down into my jaw. Sophie made a small, frightened sound behind me. I heard Miles say, "Mommy?" in a voice so uncertain it broke something loose in my chest. For 11 years I had absorbed slights, insults, exclusions, cold shoulders, and colder comments. I had absorbed all of it in silence, because I told myself that was strength, that was grace. That was the mature thing to do for the sake of my marriage and my children's peace. But a slap is not a slight. A slap is a declaration. And declarations require an answer. I set my plate down on the table beside me carefully, deliberately, the china not making a sound, and I looked at Vanessa's flushed, triumphant face, and I slapped her back. It was not as hard as hers had been. I want to be honest about that, because I've thought about this moment more times than I can count in the months since, and I don't want to dramatize it into something it wasn't. It wasn't a cinematic, world-shattering blow. It was one woman's open palm against another woman's cheek, delivered with 11 years of accumulated silence behind it. But it landed, and the sound of it, in that suddenly, completely silent garden, was the loudest thing I have ever heard in my life. Vanessa's hand flew to her own cheek, her mouth open in genuine, almost comical shock. She had never, I realized in that moment, imagined that I might hit back. In 11 years, I never had. Why would this time be different? Because this time, my children were watching. I turned to Eleanor first, because I understood, even in the ringing aftermath of the moment, that Eleanor was the one who actually held power here. Vanessa was cruel, but Vanessa was also, in her own way, a weapon Eleanor had built and pointed at me for over a decade, whether directly or through years of silent permission. "Eleanor," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected, steady in a way that surprised even me. "For 11 years, I have sat at the end of your tables. I have been introduced as Daniel's wife at events where every other spouse gets their own name. I have watched Vanessa mock my clothes, my background, my parents, and my children in front of people who laughed along, because laughing along was easier than saying something. I never said anything, because I thought silence was what love for this family required of me. I looked at Vanessa, whose cheek was turning the same shade of red as mine surely was. I was wrong, I said. Silence was never love. It was just cowardice with better manners. Someone near the back of the garden actually gasped. I heard it clearly, the way you hear things in the specific hyper-focused clarity of a moment you know you'll remember for the rest of your life. Daniel, to his credit, and I do want to give him this credit, even now stepped forward at that point, his face pale, his hand reaching for my shoulder. Claire, don't, I said, not unkindly, but with a finality that stopped him. Not right now. I need to get my children. Sophie was crying, silent tears streaking down her face, her hand gripping the back of Miles's shirt, the way she did when she was trying to protect him from something she didn't fully understand. Miles just looked confused and a little scared, glancing between me and Vanessa like he was trying to work out the rules of a game that had suddenly changed without warning. I crouched down to their level, right there in the garden, in front of everyone, because my children mattered infinitely more to me in that moment than what 40 guests thought of the scene we were making. We're going to go home now, I told them, keeping my voice as calm and warm as I could manage, despite the adrenaline roaring through my body. Everything's okay. Mommy's okay. Did Aunt Vanessa hurt you? Sophie whispered. She tried to, I said. But I'm okay. I promise. I stood back up, took each of my children by the hand, and I walked out of that garden past the string lights, past the 4 generations of gold-rimmed china, past 40 guests who would spend the rest of the night, and honestly the rest of the year, talking about nothing else, and I did not look back. Behind me, I heard fragments of the chaos I was leaving in my wake. Eleanor's voice, sharp and low, saying Vanessa's name like a warning. A cousin I barely knew murmuring, "Oh my God," to the person beside her. And underneath all of it, Vanessa's voice, cracking slightly, insisting, "She hit me first. No, wait. She hit me back." As though even she understood, in the moment, that the story was already slipping out of her control. I didn't stop walking until we reached the car. My hands were shaking as I buckled Miles into his booster seat, and I remember being grateful, in a strange, disconnected way, that my hands had waited until that moment to start shaking, rather than doing it in front of everyone. Sophie climbed into her seat without being asked, silent, watching me with an expression far too old for 9. "Are we in trouble?" she finally asked, once I'd pulled out of the long gravel drive. "No, baby," I said. "Nobody's in trouble. Grown-ups just make mistakes sometimes, and sometimes those mistakes happen in front of a lot of people. Did you make a mistake?" she pressed. I thought about that question for the entire length of the driveway before I answered her. "I don't think so," I said finally. "But I understand why it might look that way." The drive home was silent except for Miles asking, twice, if we were going to go back for cake, because apparently a slap fight is a survivable event, but missing dessert is a genuine tragedy when you're 6. I got the kids into pajamas, read Miles half of a dinosaur book before he fell asleep mid-sentence, and sat with Sophie a little longer, because at 9 she was old enough to have questions I couldn't fully answer yet. "Why did Aunt Vanessa hit you?" she asked. Sitting cross-legged on her bed, her yellow dress hung carefully on its hanger by the closet, because even in the middle of chaos, my daughter is tidy in a way I've never quite understood but deeply admire. "Because she thinks she's more important than me," I said honestly. Sophie deserved honesty, even at 9, maybe especially at 9, and for a long time, I let people treat me like that was true. "But it's not true," Sophie said, with the flat, absolute certainty that only children and very wise old women seem to possess. "No," I agreed. "It's not." "Then why did you let them?" That question sat in my chest for a long time after she fell asleep. Why did I let them? I turned it over while I sat alone in the kitchen at 11 that night, an ice pack pressed to my still throbbing cheek, listening to the house settle around me. The truth, when I finally let myself examine it honestly, was this. I had let them because I was afraid that fighting back would cost me my marriage, and I loved Daniel enough to think that price was worth paying. I had let them because I grew up watching my own mother absorb slights from difficult relatives with a smile, and some deep, unexamined part of me had learned that this was simply what good wives, good women, did. I had let them because 11 years of small accommodations had somehow, gradually, without my ever consciously agreeing to it, become the architecture of my entire adult life. Daniel came home around midnight. I heard his car in the driveway, heard the front door open and close with unusual gentleness, as though he were trying not to wake something that was already very much awake. He found me still in the kitchen. "Claire," his voice was rough. "I am so sorry. I should have said something the second her hand touched you. I should have said something years ago, honestly. And I know that. I've always tried to keep the peace with my mother and Vanessa, and I told myself that was the right thing to do, and I can see now how badly that failed you." I looked at my husband, a genuinely good man, in most of the ways that matter, who had nonetheless spent 11 years choosing the comfort of avoiding conflict with his family over the discomfort of defending his wife. And I felt something complicated settle in my chest. Not hatred. Not even, in that moment, real anger at him specifically. Just an exhausted clarity. "I know you're sorry," I said. "But I need more than sorry, Daniel. I need to understand what happens next. Because I am not going back to a life where I absorb your family's cruelty and call it grace." The story, of course, did not stay contained to that garden. 40 guests do not keep a secret. They distribute it, embellished, within 24 hours, to everyone they've ever met. By the following afternoon, my phone was a small war zone of texts from people I barely knew, some sympathetic, some scandalized, a few mostly distant Whitfield cousins outright gleeful, because apparently Vanessa had made enemies of her own over the years, and people were delighted to see her finally meet a hand she couldn't outmaneuver. Eleanor called at 9 the next morning. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was a masterclass in the kind of non-apology I had grown accustomed to over a decade. Claire, dear, I do think tempers got the better of everyone last night, and I hope we can all move past this as a family. Move past it, as though I had been the one to start it. As though 11 years of exclusion could be resolved with a single vague reference to tempers. Vanessa did not call. Vanessa posted, instead, an artfully lit photograph of herself at a spa the next day, captioned, "Healing," which even her own friends found tone-deaf enough to comment on. My own mother called too, having heard about it secondhand from a Whitfield cousin who'd apparently found my mother's number through Facebook and felt compelled to share the news like it was breaking headlines. My mother, who had spent 31 years teaching third grade and had a low tolerance for nonsense of any kind, listened to the whole story without interrupting once. "Well," she said when I finished, "I raised you better than to hit people. But I also raised you better than to let people hit you and say nothing. I suppose I should have expected you'd eventually run out of road on the second one. Are you disappointed in me?" I asked, feeling, absurdly, like I was 9 years old again, waiting for a verdict. "I'm disappointed it took you 11 years, she said. "But I'm not disappointed in you, Claire. Not for 1 second. That conversation did more to steady me than almost anything else in those first raw days. I hadn't realized how much I needed someone from outside the Whitfield ecosystem, entirely someone with no stake in the family's reputation, no old money instinct towards smoothing things over to simply tell me, plainly, that I hadn't done anything to be ashamed of. I spent that Monday doing something I hadn't done in years. I made a list. Not a to-do list, not a grocery list, a list of every single incident I could remember, across 11 years of marriage into this family. The seating charts, the comments about my dress, my parents, my background. The Christmas Eleanor forgot to invite my parents to, the year Sophie was born, even though Vanessa's in-laws had been guests of honor. The 17 times, by my count, that I had been introduced as Daniel's wife instead of Claire. Writing it all down did something strange to me. Individually, each incident was small enough to excuse, to explain away, to absorb with a tight smile, but laid end to end, in ink, in my own handwriting, they formed an unmistakable pattern. Not a series of accidents. A design. I showed the list to Daniel that evening, after the kids were asleep. He read it in silence, and I watched his face change as he went from defensive to uncomfortable to something that finally looked like real grief. Not grief for me, exactly, not yet. Grief for the version of himself who had let all of this happen without noticing, or without letting himself notice. "I didn't see it," he said finally. "I mean, I saw some of it. But not like this. Not altogether like this. That's the thing about death by 1,000 cuts," I said. "Each individual cut looks survivable. It's only when you count them all that you understand how much blood you've lost. I want to be clear about something, because I think it matters. I did not leave Daniel that week. I did not pack the children into the car and drive to my mother's house in Ohio, though God knows the thought crossed my mind more than once in the days after that dinner. What I did instead was harder, in some ways, than leaving would have been. I stayed, and I drew a line, and I made it clear to Daniel, and through him, to his mother and his sister, exactly where that line was and what would happen if it was crossed again. I am not asking you to cut off your family, I told Daniel, 3 days after the anniversary dinner, once the initial shock had settled into something we could actually talk through. I understand they're your mother and your sister, but I need you to understand something too. I will not attend another family event where I am treated as less than an equal member of this family. Not seated at the end of the table. Not introduced without my name. Not touched by your sister ever again. For any reason. If that happens, I will not simply absorb it and smile through dinner. I will leave, and I will take our children with me, and I will not come back until there has been a real accounting. Not a vague apology about tempers, but an actual acknowledgement of what's been done and a change in how it's done going forward. Daniel didn't argue. I think, in a strange way, the slap mine, not Vanessa's, had done something that 11 years of quiet unhappiness never managed to do. It had made the problem impossible to ignore, impossible to smooth over with a change of subject or a let's not make a thing of it. 40 witnesses do that. A public reckoning, however humiliating in the moment, has a way of forcing honesty that private suffering never can. He went to his mother alone, the following weekend, without me, and had what he later described as the most difficult conversation of his adult life. He told me, much later, some of what was said. He told Eleanor that he had spent his entire marriage assuming that keeping peace between his wife and his family was simply a matter of time and patience, that eventually the friction would wear itself smooth. He told her that watching Vanessa's hand connect with my face had been the moment he finally understood that he'd been wrong. Some friction doesn't wear smooth with time. It just wears the person underneath it down instead. I asked her directly, he told me, whether she'd ever really seen you as family or just as someone I happened to marry, and she didn't answer right away. That silence told me more than anything she could have said. I don't know everything that was said in that conversation, and I've made peace with not knowing all of it. But I know this. Eleanor called me 2 weeks later, and for the first time in 11 years, her apology contained no qualifiers. I have not been fair to you, Claire, she said, her voice quieter than I had ever heard it. I told myself for years that my standards were about protecting the family, about maintaining what we've built. But Daniel made me see that what I was actually protecting was my own comfort, at your expense, for over a decade. I am sorry. Truly. And I understand if that sorry means very little to you right now. It did mean something, actually. Not everything, trust, once broken over 11 years, doesn't rebuild in a single phone call, however sincere. But it meant something. Vanessa never called at all. 3 weeks after the anniversary dinner, Eleanor hosted a much smaller gathering, just immediate family, an attempt, I think, at genuine repair rather than performance. I almost didn't go. Daniel understood completely when I told him I wasn't sure I could sit across a table from Vanessa again so soon. But I went, in the end, because I realized something important in those 3 weeks. I had spent 11 years avoiding confrontation because I was afraid of what it might cost me. And the one time I hadn't avoided it, the one time I had let a slap land instead of swallowing it, it had cost me nothing that mattered and gained me more respect, from Daniel, from Eleanor, even from strangers who'd heard the story, than a decade of silence ever had. So I went, and I sat down across from Vanessa at Eleanor's smaller table, and I said what I had been rehearsing in my head for 3 weeks. I'm not here to fight with you again, I told her, calmly, while Daniel and Eleanor sat in tense silence on either side of us. I'm here because I think you and I need to actually understand each other, for the first time, honestly. You've disliked me since the day Daniel brought me home. I've always assumed it was because I wasn't born into money the way you were. But I want to ask you directly, what is it actually? Because I don't think it's really about money at all. Vanessa was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that I genuinely didn't expect an honest answer. You made it look easy, she finally said, not meeting my eyes. Daniel adored you from the first week. My husband and I had to build something that looked like that, over years, with a great deal of effort and a fair amount of performing. And you just had it. Effortlessly. It made me feel like everything I'd built was fake by comparison. End quote. It wasn't an excuse for a slap. I want to be clear about that. Nothing excuses putting your hands on another person. But it was, for the first time in 11 years, an honest thing. And honest things are at least something you can work with. I didn't have it easy, I told her. I worked 2 jobs through college. I've spent 11 years being made to feel like I don't belong in this family. In rooms I was legally, by marriage, entitled to be in. Effortless is not the word I would have chosen. We didn't become friends that day. I want to be honest about that too, because I think there's a version of this story people want to hear, where the villain becomes a friend by the final act. And that's not what happened here. What happened was smaller and more realistic. An uneasy, watchful respect began to grow where there had only been contempt before. Vanessa apologized a real apology. This time, not a spa photo, and I accepted it. Not because the wound was healed, but because I understood that some relationships don't need to be healed to be workable. They just need honesty, and boundaries, and consequences that are actually enforced. Boundaries, I learned that year, are only real once they've been tested. Anyone can declare a line. What matters is what happens the first time someone tries to step over it anyway. The test came at Thanksgiving, 4 months after the anniversary dinner. Eleanor hosted, as always, and the table was set the way it always had been for years, except this time, my place card sat directly beside Daniel's, at the center of the table, not at the far end near the kitchen door. It was such a small thing, and it meant more to me than I expected it to. I remember staring at that place card for a long moment before I sat down, feeling something in my chest unclench that I hadn't fully realized was still clenched. Vanessa arrived late, flustered from traffic, and made a beeline for the buffet the moment she walked in, the old habit apparently dying hard. I watched her reach for a serving spoon, catch herself, glance around the room, and then visibly, deliberately step back and let two other guests go ahead of her first. It wasn't dramatic. Nobody but me seemed to notice it at all. But I noticed, and I understood it for what it was. Not an apology, exactly, but an acknowledgement. A small, private correction that cost her nothing to make and meant, to me, quite a lot. Later that evening, though, came the real test. One of Eleanor's old friends, a woman named Patricia who'd clearly heard some secondhand version of the anniversary story, cornered me near the dessert table with the particular gleeful curiosity of someone who wanted gossip dressed up as concern. "I heard there was quite a scene at your anniversary dinner," Patricia said, eyebrows raised, waiting. 6 months earlier, I would have deflected, laughed it off, changed the subject, anything to avoid being the center of an uncomfortable conversation at someone else's party. Instead, I looked her directly in the eye. "There was," I said simply. "My sister-in-law slapped me in front of 40 guests, and I slapped her back, and then I told my husband's family, in no uncertain terms, that it would never happen again. It hasn't. I'd call that a fairly successful outcome, wouldn't you?" Patricia blinked, clearly unprepared for a direct answer instead of the flustered, apologetic deflection she'd been fishing for. "Well," she said finally, "I suppose that's one way to look at it. It's the only way that matters to me," I said, and excused myself to go find my children, who were, predictably, engaged in a fierce negotiation with Eleanor's housekeeper over the number of dinner rolls a person was allowed to eat before pie. I understood, walking away from that conversation, that this was the actual victory, not the slap itself, which I still had complicated feelings about, but this, my ability to state what had happened plainly, without apology, without shrinking, in a room full of people who might judge me for it. 11 years earlier, I would have found some way to make Patricia comfortable at my own expense. That Thanksgiving, I didn't. And the sky did not fall. Nobody exiled me from the family. Nobody whispered about me for weeks afterward, or if they did, I never heard about it and, more importantly, no longer cared whether I did. I want to tell you a little more about Vanessa, because I think it would be too easy, too satisfying in the wrong way, to leave her as simply the villain of this story, the woman who slapped me at my own anniversary dinner and got what was coming to her. Real people are rarely that simple, and if I'm honest about everything I learned that year, I have to be honest about this too. Vanessa's marriage I learned much later, from Daniel, who learned it from Eleanor, who I think finally started being honest with her son about a great many things once the dam had broken. Vanessa's marriage was not the gleaming, effortless thing it appeared to be at family gatherings. Her husband, Preston, came from a family even wealthier and even colder than the Whitfields, and from what Daniel pieced together over the following months, Vanessa had spent the better part of a decade performing a kind of relentless, exhausting perfection for Preston's family, terrified that any crack in the performance would cost her the marriage, the status, the life she'd built her entire identity around. She had never worked, not because she lacked ambition, but because Preston's mother had made it clear, early on, that a coal wife did not need to work, and that wanting to would reflect poorly on Preston's ability to provide. She had, in other words, been quietly shrinking herself for years too, in her own gilded version of the exact same trap I'd been living in, just with better lighting and more expensive furniture. None of that excused what she did to me at that dinner, and I want to be very clear that I don't think pain excuses cruelty, ever, under any circumstances. But it helped me understand her, and understanding, I've found, does something valuable, even when it doesn't lead all the way to forgiveness. It takes the sting out of confusion. It replaces "why would anyone do this to me?" with a more answerable, more bearable question: what was she actually protecting when she did it? What Vanessa was protecting, I came to believe, was the last remaining thing she felt she had power over the family hierarchy she'd spent years learning to navigate and enforce. The one place where she outranked someone, even if that someone was simply her brother's wife serving herself a scallop a half-second too early. My effortless ease with Daniel, the ease she'd named honestly that day at Eleanor's smaller table, had threatened the one domain where she still felt in control. I don't say any of this to excuse her hand against my face. I say it because, months later, when Vanessa and I sat down for coffee, just the two of us, no Daniel, no Eleanor, no audience of any kind, she told me something that has stayed with me since. "I used to think you were naive," she said, turning her cup slowly on the table between us. "That you didn't understand how families like ours actually worked, how much effort it takes to maintain a place in them. Now I think maybe you understood something I didn't. You never tried to earn your place, you just assumed you already had one. I spent 10 years trying to earn mine, and I still don't think I actually believe I have it." "You could just decide you do," I told her. "Nobody's stopping you except you at this point." She laughed, a little bitterly. "That's very easy for the woman who's never had to fight for anything to say." "I fought for plenty," I said. "I just fought for different things than you did. And for the record, I'm still fighting. I just stopped fighting to be small enough not to bother anyone. We didn't solve everything over that one cup of coffee. But it was the most honest conversation the two of us had ever had in 11 years of knowing each other, and I've come to think that honesty, even hard, uncomfortable, imperfect honesty, is worth more than a decade of polite silence ever was. The thing I think about most, a year on from that anniversary dinner, isn't Vanessa's hand against my face, or even my hand against hers. It's the conversation I had with Sophie a few months later, when she came home from school upset about a girl in her class who had been excluding her from a friend group, whispering about her within earshot, making her feel small in the particular, precise way that only other 9-year-old girls seem to know how to do. "What do I do, Mom?" she asked me, sitting at the kitchen table with her homework forgotten in front of her. And I found myself telling her something I would not have known how to say a year earlier, before that garden, before that slap, before 11 years of silence finally broke open into something honest. "You don't have to be cruel back," I told her, "but you also don't have to keep smiling while someone hurts you and call it kindness. There's a difference between being kind and being quiet, Sophie. Being kind means you treat people with respect, even when it's hard. Being quiet just means you let people treat you badly, because saying something feels scarier than staying silent. I spent a lot of years confusing the two. I don't want you to make that same mistake." "Is that why you hit Aunt Vanessa?" she asked. I thought about how to answer that honestly, in a way a 9-year-old could actually use. "I'm not proud that I hit her," I said. And I meant it. Violence, even in response to violence, was never really the lesson I wanted my children to take from that night. "What I am proud of is that I stopped being quiet." I told her, clearly, that what she did was wrong, and I told your grandmother and your dad the same thing, and I made sure they understood it wasn't going to happen again. That part, the speaking up part, that's the part I want you to remember, not the slap, the line I drew after it. Sophie considered this with the particular gravity 9-year-olds bring to conversations they've decided matter. "So I should tell the girls at school to stop, instead of just being sad about it," she said. "Exactly that," I said. Clearly, calmly. "If you can manage it, I know that part's hard." But clearly. She did, as it turned out. Her teacher called 2 weeks later, not to report a problem, but to tell me, with some amusement, that Sophie had organized what the teacher called a very calm and very thorough conversation with the girl who'd been excluding her, laying out exactly how the exclusion had made her feel and what she expected going forward. The other girl's mother later told me, at pickup, that her daughter had come home saying Sophie was kind of scary in a good way, which I have decided to consider one of the finer compliments my daughter has ever received. Miles, being 6 and then 7, processed the whole thing rather differently. For months afterward, he would occasionally announce, apropos of nothing, usually at the dinner table, "Mom hit Aunt Vanessa," in the same tone he might use to announce that dinosaurs were extinct, a simple, established fact of the universe, mildly interesting, not especially dramatic. Once, at school, during a unit on conflict resolution, he raised his hand and told his teacher that his mom's solution to conflict was to hit the person back one time and then use her words a lot afterward, which resulted in a fairly memorable phone call from his teacher that I still, a year later, cannot retell without laughing. But underneath the humor of it, I noticed something more serious taking root in both my children. Miles stopped, almost overnight, doing the thing he used to do where he'd silently hand over a toy to an older cousin who demanded it, swallowing his own upset rather than object. He started saying, plainly, "I'm using this right now," and meaning it. Small things, age-appropriate things, but the same architecture, I realized, being built in miniature, the understanding that his own feelings, his own claims, were worth stating out loud rather than absorbing in silence. I hadn't set out to teach my children that lesson through a slap at an anniversary dinner. If I could have taught it to them gently, through calm conversation and quiet modeling over years, I would have chosen that path in a heartbeat. But I've come to believe that children learn less from what we tell them, and more from what they watch us actually do in the moments that matter most. And what they watched me do, that night in the garden, was refuse, finally, after 11 years, to make myself smaller for anyone's comfort. A year later, our family looks different than it did before that anniversary dinner, though from the outside, at a glance, most things would appear the same. We still see Daniel's family. We still attend holidays and birthdays and the occasional Sunday dinner. Daniel still loves his mother and his sister, and I've made my peace with that, because loving imperfect people is, in the end, most of what love actually is. But the architecture underneath it all has changed completely. I am introduced by my name now, every time. Without fail, Eleanor makes a visible point of it, as though she's still working off a debt she knows she owes. I sit wherever I choose at family dinners, and no one has suggested otherwise since. Vanessa and I maintain something that isn't warmth exactly, but is honest, and bounded, and infinitely more respectful than what came before. And Daniel has become, in the year since, a genuinely different kind of husband. Not because he didn't love me before, I believe he always did, in his way, but because he finally understood that love which doesn't defend you when it counts isn't actually protecting anything at all. He speaks up now, in rooms where he used to stay comfortably silent. He notices things he used to let pass unnoticed. It cost us something to get here, a public humiliation, a slapped face, a story that traveled through his family's entire social circle within a day. But I've come to believe it was a cost worth paying, because the alternative was another 11 years of silence, and I don't think I had another 11 years of that left in me. People sometimes ask me, when they hear this story, and by now, plenty of people have heard it, whether I regret slapping Vanessa back. Whether I wish I'd handled it differently, more gracefully, in a way that wouldn't have made a public scene of my own anniversary. I understand the question. Genuinely, I do. Violence should never be anyone's first answer. And if I could go back, there's a version of me that wishes I'd found the words to draw that line years earlier, before it ever had to come to a slap at all mine or hers. But I don't regret the moment itself, not really, because that slap wasn't really about Vanessa's hand on my cheek. It was about 11 years of my hand never once, not one single time, being raised in my own defense. It was the sound of 11 years of silence finally breaking. And on the other side of that broken silence, I found something I hadn't had in over a decade. A family, Daniel's, and my own, that finally, truly saw me. Not as Daniel's wife, not as the woman at the end of the table, as Claire. Exactly as I am, exactly as I always should have been seen. There's a version of this story that ends at the family dinner table, with everyone reconciled and the architecture of our lives rebuilt into something fairer. That part is true, as far as it goes. But I'd be leaving something important out if I didn't tell you what changed inside me, separate from anything to do with the Whitfields at all. For 11 years, I had quietly let my own career shrink to fit around the emotional labor of managing this family. I'd left the nonprofit 2 years after Sophie was born, in part because childcare made the math difficult, but in part, I understand now, because some unspoken expectation had settled over me that a Whitfield wife's real job was managing the social machinery of the family, the gifts, the thank you notes, the seating charts I was never allowed to actually control, the endless small diplomacies required to keep the peace between Eleanor's world and my own. In the months after that anniversary dinner, I found myself with an unfamiliar amount of energy. Some of it, I think, was simply the absence of all the effort I used to spend managing my own smallness, a kind of exhaustion I hadn't recognized as exhaustion until it lifted. I used that energy to do something I'd quietly wanted to do for years and never quite let myself pursue. I went back to the literacy nonprofit, the same one where I'd met Daniel at that long-ago gala, and I asked if they needed help. They did. Within 4 months, I was running a pilot program across 6 school districts. Within a year, I'd been offered a director position I would never have believed, 11 years earlier, standing awkwardly at the edge of that ballroom in my clearance rack navy dress, that I would ever actually hold. I think about that sometimes, how the woman who slapped Vanessa in front of 40 guests and the woman who now runs literacy programs across an entire region are, in some fundamental way, the same act of refusal repeated in different rooms. Both of them are versions of me deciding, finally, that I was allowed to take up space. That my voice, my name, my work, my presence at the table, all of it didn't need to be earned through 11 years of quiet, agreeable shrinking. It was simply mine, and had been mine the whole time, if only I'd been willing to claim it. Daniel noticed the change too, and to his credit, he didn't just tolerate it, he actively made room for it, in ways both large and small. He rearranged his own schedule to handle school pickups on the 2 evenings a week my new job required late meetings. He started, unprompted, correcting people at family events who introduced me only as Daniel's wife, gently but firmly supplying my actual name and my actual title, as though he'd appointed himself the family's official corrector of a habit he now recognized for what it had always been. "I used to think loving you meant keeping things smooth," he told me once, about 8 months after that anniversary dinner. "Now I think it means making sure you never have to smooth yourself out for anyone, including me." I won't pretend our marriage healed instantly, or that I stopped, for a long while, carrying a certain wariness into every family gathering, waiting to see whether the old patterns would quietly reassert themselves the moment everyone's guard was down. Old patterns are stubborn. 11 years of a certain shape doesn't unlearn itself in a single season, however dramatic the turning point. But I noticed, gathering by gathering, that the wariness eased a little more each time, replaced slowly by something I hadn't let myself feel in that family's presence in longer than I could remember. Ease. Genuine, unguarded ease. Sophie is 10 now, Miles is 7, and he still, to this day, brings up the fact that we missed cake that night, as though it remains the single greatest injustice of his young life. Eleanor hosts our anniversary dinner every year now, and every year, without fail, she makes a small, deliberate point of it. The buffet is served with guests of honor first. My name is said clearly and often, and Vanessa keeps her hands, and her comments, carefully to herself. Last month, at dinner, Sophie leaned over to me during dessert cake, this time, thankfully, and whispered, "Mom, remember when you slapped Aunt Vanessa?" "I remember," I said. "I'm glad you did," she said, matter of fact, the way only children can be about things adults spend years agonizing over. "You should always stick up for yourself, that's what you tell me." "That's what I tell you," I agreed. And watching my daughter go back to her cake, completely unbothered, completely secure in a lesson I wish I'd learned 20 years earlier than I did, I thought, whatever else that night cost me the awkward stares, the gossip, the discomfort of becoming, briefly, the most talked about woman at a 40-guest party, it was worth it for that alone. For a 9-year-old girl who now understands, in a way I didn't understand until I was 36, that being kind and being quiet are not the same thing, and that a woman's place in her own family is never something she has to earn by shrinking herself to fit into it. It's something she's simply owed. From the very first day. The end.